Hello, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Ria Stark. I'm the Digital Engagement Manager here at TLC, and today we are going to give you 3 reasons to host your library data in the cloud and tell you what a cloud or cloud hosting is in case you're like me and didn't know that. So before we give away those 3 reasons, I do have some 3 quick housekeeping tips. First, we are live this Wednesday afternoon, and for those of you joining us here today, you have the opportunity to ask our panelist questions. So if you think of anything throughout the presentation, please add them into that question section, and we will answer them at the end. Also, if you would like to share this webinar with your colleagues or rewatch it again later, it is being recorded. So you can view the replay starting tomorrow from our website at tlcdelivers.com/webinars. And last thing, before you log out, do be sure to download those handouts for additional information about TLC and TLC Cloud Services. So our expert today is TLC's Chief Technology Officer, Justin Duewel-Zahniser. Justin knows more about hosting, virtual servers, and security than we could ever fit into a 30-minute webinar. But he's also really great at taking those technical concepts and making them easy to understand. So Justin, thank you so much for lending your expertise to us for Webinar Wednesday.
All right, thank you, Ria. Yeah, looking forward to trying to demystify and explain some good reasons to move towards cloud hosting here. So let's jump right into what we're all in for. So what's up? What are we going to talk about here? Couple kind of big sections here. The first one, I thought it would be very good here to kind of compare and contrast different sort of hosting models to better define the cloud in terms of how it differs from other things people may be familiar with. So we're going to talk about that in the section called Where's My Stuff? And then we're going to further break down the cloud a little bit and go into some of the benefits, but also what differentiates it further from some of these other models and gives it some benefits and strengths. In a section we're calling What Even Are Clouds? And hopefully we'll answer that question. And then to talk a little bit about TLC cloud services in particular and kind of talk about our solution, compare that to some of our previous solutions, and really try to answer the question in that title slide there as best we can. And then, as Ria mentioned, we'll roll right into a question and answer session. So I will do my best to respond with no preparation to anything that you throw at me. And of course, we'll make some information available if you don't get your question answered or you think of it after the presentation ends, which is how all good questions come about. And we'll try to follow up and make sure we get everything addressed for you. So let's dive right into Where's My Stuff? So we're going to break down the model of hosting into 4 kind of big categories here. It's really 3 categories, and then one thing we want to call out as not really a category, but kind of related to these things, and that's the web-based piece. So Where's My Stuff is all about in these hosting models, when I'm using my library system or any piece of software that follows one of these hosting models, where is it? How am I getting to it? What does that mean for my service experience? And a lot of this is setting up that contrast that I'm going to attempt to do in the later slides. So the first Where's My Stuff model, and what in current terms is probably the more sort of traditional model, is customer on-premise, or shortened on-premise, or because, and this is a thing I love about IT and libraries, we share a love of acronyms and also abbreviating things, or in this case, abbreviating them. So the abbrev that we tend to use for customer on-premise is on-prem. So if you hear on-prem, talking about customer on-premise. And this really means that you or someone who works with you, or county or city IT or district IT or what have you, has some servers running somewhere in your environment. That could be in a building you work in, could be in another location, but it's really on your network. So that is on-premise at the customer site, meaning it's somewhere that belongs to you. And I've been in this industry for quite a while, and my kind of first journey through this industry, this was really the predominant model, is libraries would buy servers. Typically, the vendor would help the library buy the server, install the software, and kind of support it remotely. The kind of next evolution of that, and there were a lot of factors that went into this, but there's some kind of key benefits, and I'm try not to get too ahead of the talking about the cloud piece, because they really get those benefits that apply to hosting get even better when you go to the cloud model. But the hosted model is really when you say, okay, I don't want to manage this server. I can't, I don't want to, or you could do a better job of it. So the vendor agrees to set up the server somewhere totally outside your network, not on your prem, if you will, and provides it as a kind of hosted or managed service. And that typically means that you are connecting over the internet in some fashion to get to your service. And the service provider, which in most cases will be the vendor of the software, but not all of them, is responsible for maintaining the servers and network connections and all that kind of stuff. And that often occurs in like a data center, or maybe a server farm that the provider has. The cloud model is, and there's some variations on this, which I'll get into in the slides as well, but the cloud model is similar to the hosted model from the standpoint of the customer, because again, the computers that are running everything are not inside your network, they're not on your premise, you're getting to them over the internet. So the cloud model, experience-wise, from an end user standpoint, is similar to the hosted model. But there's some kind of key differences between the traditional hosted model and what we call cloud in terms of technology. And this is a big thing I want to focus on kind of explaining or demystifying here is, what is the difference between just hosted and cloud? What do we mean when we say that? How do they compare and contrast, and what are the benefits? But both of those are not on your prem, as we said. And one thing that we often get is, if I use a web browser to get to it, is it hosted? Is it in the cloud? Where is it? And that is really a different concept from where's my stuff, because you could be using the web browser to access it on your local network, and the server is sitting in the room next to you. Web-based is really just the way the interface works, the way the software is delivered, meaning you pull up a browser, you go to a site. You didn't have to install the software. It's not client-based, it's using the browser. But that doesn't actually tell you where it lives. You could even pull up web-based software and connect to it and run it, and it's running on the same computer you're running the web browser on. So web-based is really a different concept, and in all of these models, you can be using web-based software. And at TLC, we actually support all three of these models in different fashions. We'll go into some of the details on that, but not super deep. So in all cases, we have web-based software hosted by some customers on-premise, some hosted, and some in the cloud model. So hopefully that kind of gives you a little bit of an intro to the differences between these hosting models. I'm going to go into the section we call What Even Are Clouds, and try to break this down. One of my kind of favorite quotes, this gets bandied about in the IT world, is the cloud is other people's computers. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but it actually points out something important that I think webinars like this, hopefully if I do a good job, help with, which is a lot of things get called cloud when they're simply not on premise. And that's because there's a lot of kind of marketing value behind calling something cloud, right? It's the new sounding thing, it's the fancy sounding thing. If I say, oh, this is hosted, it doesn't sound as cool as, oh, this is cloud-based. So there are a lot of solutions out there that are referred to as cloud-based, but they don't necessarily have all the characteristics of what is generally considered a cloud service in the IT world. So that's really what we want to break down here. So, but it is true that that the cloud is other people's computers, because it basically means that whatever is running the software is generally, as I said, outside of your network and location, and you aren't owning and therefore being responsible for the hardware that's running it. So what are some of those things that distinguish that model? So typically in a cloud solution, um, the computing resources, the servers, are going to be both on demand and therefore virtual. So if you connect to some cloud server that's running Windows and you connect there and you're doing all your Windows stuff, that is not necessarily mapping to, and in most cases won't be mapping to one physical server. It's really a virtual server that's running on a whole, giant cluster of hardware with redundancy across locations and all kinds of complicated setup. And that enables a couple other characteristics, like the ability to get more servers on demand. So you create another virtual server instance out of this big sort of hardware farm. You can, provided the cloud provider has available capacity that they can allocate, you can get new servers as needed. Whereas if you're in an on-premise situation and specifically not virtualizing, and you say, oh darn, our 2 servers aren't cutting it, we need a third, let's go order something. There's a physical delivery process. You have to place the order, it has to be configured, it has to be tested, it has to be shipped, then it has to be kind of set up and deployed locally, configured, etc. In the cloud model, there should be excess capacity available, and you can say, I need a new server, and it's pretty much just the provisioning time for that, which, depending on the environment and the type of server and what you're doing with it, could be as little as minutes. Cloud services tend to also be managed, and managed is one of those businessy buzzwords, but it basically means that there is a significant portion of the operational stuff that goes into keeping the servers running and keeping the environment performing and secure and various other things that you are not responsible for, because that is built into the price you pay to use the service. Whoever is providing the cloud service takes care of a bunch of things that if you owned the server, you would have to do instead. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And then to throw some more abbreves out here, it tends to be a kind of operating expenditure versus capital expenditure model. So because these resources are on demand, you tend to rent them because you can use them for a period of time and get rid of them, versus a server, which is a capital expenditure for a physical good that you pay and then you try to get value out of it over the lifetime of the device before it, goes kaput or can no longer keep up to the demands placed on it. So in that OpEx model, you are generally renting the resources. And without getting too deep on this, there are different kind of financial structures to capital expenditures and operating expenditures. So in some organizations, the same dollar spent on one or the other will actually be preferable. So, if you said $10 OpEx versus $10 CapEx, there would be reasons why one or the other is actually preferred, even though the dollar amount is the same. And then another thing that typically comes into play with the cloud environment is, and I mentioned in kind of the virtual setup and with redundancy, there tends to be a lot of different locations involved, and those locations tend to be a little bit more abstract. So I'll talk about some of our kind of deployment capabilities as we go on, but most kind of cloud solutions operate in a number of different locations, and they will behave the same depending, they'll behave the same more or less across locations, but for any like local regulations in specific countries and things of that nature. And then they don't always have, but a lot of them have something called elasticity, which is another one of those fancy, cool sounding buzzwords. But elasticity really means the ability to automatically scale up and down resources as needed. So if you have an elastic setup and you have some servers that are under unusually heavy load and require more resources than they would normally require for kind of standard operations. They can get access rather quickly to additional capacity, handle that load, and then you can get rid of the extra capacity and ideally not pay for it anymore once the load goes back down. This is, often used for services like Netflix and YouTube and things like that when, there's some specific content that comes out that is extremely popular and use and engagement spikes for a period of time. They'll want to provision extra resources to keep everything running smoothly. And then when it goes down to back to kind of normal usage, they'll decommission some of those virtual servers. And that's referred to as elasticity, basically the ability to stretch and contract like elastic, shockingly. Some of our metaphors in this industry are actually pretty good. So hopefully that breaks down a little bit of kind of what the cloud is and some of the differences specifically between on-premise. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in, again, some more acronyms, for the layers of the cloud. And this is really describing kind of different tiers or types of service that are common in cloud models. And these three are really core. There's some other ones. Some of them are a little on the nose and too marketing-y, but these are pretty consistent and I think helpful for understanding a cloud platform. So the first one is called Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS. Not the most wieldy of acronyms. Infrastructure as a service is really referring to, I talked on the previous slide a bit about sort of quote unquote renting these servers. So infrastructure as a service is a layer of a cloud solution that generally speaking you use to run things. And so these are your virtual computers, virtual servers, networking equipment. This is really in computing terms, the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure. The next kind of layer up the I don't know, cloud layers here is platform as a service, PaaS. This one is generally referred to as PaaS. And platform as a service, a good way to think about this is you use this to make stuff. And this is typically itself running on the infrastructure layer. What do we mean by you use this to make stuff? So this could be like databases, programming frameworks, middleware, software systems, and things deployed to help you build applications or solutions, not necessarily code them, but they're kind of foundational software and they provide a quote unquote platform to do other things. And the third tier here is called software as a service, or SaaS. And this is what, from an end user perspective, we mostly run into. And this I generally think of as you use this to do stuff. So this is actual software. And I'm guessing the folks attending now could rattle off a number of things that you use day to day that are really SaaS, which means you access it remotely, it's running in a cloud environment. It is what used to be software that you had to install on your computer, but instead of having to own it and install it, you are accessing it as a service provided in some remote environment. So I bet you can think of some. And some of them are as simple as, Gmail, Office 365. And if you are new to this term or not very familiar with it, you are probably using a lot more SaaS than you thought you were or realized. And so we're going to go into TLC cloud services, but to really kind of describe these pieces, we use a mix of infrastructure as a service and platform as a service to provide you with your software as a service. If there's any fans of memes out there, this is the full yo dog exhibit meme, right? So we are using infrastructure as a service to get computers and networking equipment. We are using databases and other things at the platform layer that the software that we use requires to operate. And then we operate the software in the SaaS layer and make that available to you to connect to your library system or various other services that we have that fall into SaaS. So that's kind of how the ecosystem there ties together to create a full software as a service solution. You can technically deliver something like software as a service without a cloud platform, quote unquote, based on some of the characteristics that we talked about. The key thing there is typically that it is delivered as a service, not requiring a local install or local management. But these are really, the three layers that make up most cloud offerings, and they're different, but as you can see, they're quite additive. So let's try to take this understanding and build on top of it and talk a little bit in the context of TLC cloud services about delivering on the promise of the title slide, 3 reasons to consider a cloud hosting solution. So broke this down into 3 categories here, and there's certainly more than this, but I think these are 3 that are important for people to understand and kind of come up a lot as needs, requirements, or benefits when we talk to customers. One of them is the kind of lower operational burden, and this goes deeper as well, but 3 easy ways to understand this are staff time and focus. So all of the kind of management stuff that you had to deal with the server, that can focus on dealing with better delivering services in the library. So if we're even talking about IT resources, maybe there are workstations, pack stations, optimizations, things that could take focus that aren't add more value day to day than just please make sure the server continues running correctly. That takes IT resources and puts them in a little bit more kind of service and experience delivery mode as opposed to just kind of maintenance and break fix again. And you get out of the procurement cycle as well. And this is an interesting one, and depending on your role, you may not have to tangle with this, but in the kind of customer on-premise model to some degree, you have a kind of a lifespan for those servers when you're dealing with operating system upgrades, or as software gets more powerful over time, it requires more resources, these things age out. You have to kind of plan ahead of time and budget ahead of time and manage this cycle of replenishing the hardware that you use so everything can stay in a proper running form and secure, which we'll get into next. And that is something that requires time and attention and focus and planning, and it can be inconsistent for budgeting. I mentioned that whole CapEx versus OpEx thing. It can be inconsistent for budgeting because you have to remember every X number of years, I need to allocate this sort of big chunk to replace all the hardware that runs this stuff, and there may be associated knock-on requirements there. Versus the OpEx model, the kind of cloud delivery model, I get that essentially amortized over this annual rate that I have predictable budgeting for. So I know every year I basically have this, for the term of the contract, I have this annual fee which covers all of that. And in fact, if it takes more resources or something breaks and needs to be replaced behind the scenes on the service provider's end, on TLC's end in this case, that burden basically doesn't fall on you because you're paying a rate for the service, and we're responsible for managing all of the resource commitments and availability and replenishment cycles so that that's all as invisible as possible to you. So that goes into a little bit of the finance side there, but the predictability of budgeting is helpful, especially when you're dealing with sources of grant funding and other things like that. It can be very helpful to have predictability for things like that. So that's a little bit about the kind of lower operational burden. Things you don't have to worry about anymore: backup power, UPCs, generators. What do we do if we lose power? Do we lose all our data? Server crashes and restarts, operating system updates, server security, even server physical security. So if the server is running somewhere in the library and it's not under lock and key, what do you do to protect somebody who's being mean from just going and messing with it physically? and then server replacement, which I talked about in the procurement cycle. So there's more than that, but those are some highlights of things that essentially you get to ignore going forward and take all of that time, bandwidth, and cognition and apply it to providing better services. The second one here is security piece. And one of the advantages of the cloud model is certainly that the cloud system is built to handle the security requirements of extremely large, very sophisticated, very demanding organizations, including federal agencies and defense contractors and all kinds of things with pretty stringent security requirements. So when you move into an environment like that, from both kind of on-premise or just a kind of hosted data center model, you really inherit a lot of those benefits pretty much automatically from moving into that environment. And some of these types of benefits, and there's a laundry list behind this, but some of these types of benefits are things like encryption of data in motion. So you're accessing this over the internet, which means when you pull up your browser and you load a page, that request is going out of the library's network over the internet to the cloud environment and back. So that needs to be properly secured, and that's referred to as data in motion, which thankfully we haven't decided should be an acronym called DIM. Sometimes we avoid the acronym trap. The next one is data at rest, and this means when things are written to the hard drive, the file system, the database, and that data is resting on a disk somewhere, it also needs to be properly encrypted and secured so that if anybody did get physical access to that environment and copied the data off, it would be essentially useless to them. And that is another thing that if you have some kind of software that you produced and managed and had this requirement in a local environment, there's a fair amount of cost and complexity and operational complexity around ensuring that that's all protected. There's also things like environmental security, and that could include key card access and biometrics to get into secure areas of the facility where the things that are running these even exist, and all kinds of things that, again, are expensive to provide locally, but are increasingly important in the kind of modern age of cyber threats. And then what I call kind of supplemental security, and this is not a real term of art, but I use this to summarize as a good way to contrast is if you are operating your system on premise, you have to provide a ton of that security and security experience yourself. So if somebody's trying to break into that server, certainly as a vendor will assist, but a lot of that has to do with your own kind of network and computing defenses locally. So to some degree, your security capacity is whatever your security capacity is. You move into that hosted model and you add a second kind of layer of defense or resources there, which is the vendor. So now that we're providing that managed service, we're involved in the security of the system, even more so than we are when you're operating it on premise, where most of our work is around making sure that the software itself is properly secure, but not necessarily the server network, et cetera. So you move into that hosted model, and it's kind of like you plus us is your line of defense, not just you, right? When you move into that cloud hosted model, you kind of pick up a third person, and generally with a serious commercial grade cloud service, that third person has a lot of resources, and that is whoever provides the underlying cloud platform that is being used to deliver the service. So there, in our case, we work with Oracle Cloud as the provider, and you're getting the benefit of your security capabilities plus our security capabilities plus Oracle's security capabilities. They have a vested interest in securing that environment as well, and they have tools and resources available to assist you and us with doing so. So you bring this kind of third pool of resources and capability and knowledge into the mix, and that adds a lot of value to your overall capability, both to secure things and to respond if there's a breach of some sort, heaven forbid. So security is a really big piece of this, and one thing I would call out there is the first sort of three sub-bullets there: data in motion, data at rest, environmental security. Those can be done in any environment. It's quite expensive, but they can be done in any environment. You really benefit from the kind of cost scaling of the cloud platform when you pick that up. The supplemental is trickier, right? Because if you're in the library and you want to hire security consultants, and then you want to hire a second layer of even bigger security consultants, that's really a non-starter. It's quite expensive. It's very unwieldy to manage multiple parties. Wouldn't even necessarily make sense in a lot of cases. Now, if you do work with security consultants, I'm not suggesting you don't do that, but managing multiple people in that relationship and all their capacities is another one of those kind of staff time and focus and IT resource things that is important, but really distracts from your mission of delivering your library services. And the last piece, I'll spend a little bit less time on this, but this is important as well. It's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of reach available in these platforms, and two things I talk about here. One is kind of geolocations. So the cloud platform enables the delivery of this service in a consistent way in a bunch of different regions throughout the world. So from the TLC perspective, in the cloud service offering, we can provision a server very rapidly in North America, in the US, in Canada, East Coast, West Coast, Japan, Singapore, New Zealand, you name it. And the process is really identical for us and very sort of predictable. And one of the main ways this kind of turns into a benefit for customers is, you may think, well, I really only want to operate in the location that's closest to me. That's how I'll get the best service. Yes, that's true. In a disaster scenario of some sort, the availability of these geolocations and the fact that the service is predictable gives us a capability to restore service. Let's say an earthquake happened and a data center was damaged and offline for a while. Because we have access to a consistent, predictable platform in another region, we could restore service much more quickly. Whereas, like, certainly on the on-premise model, if you have things operating in an office somewhere and some building issue occurs or something and that server is offline, that is a much trickier prospect because you have to find that capacity somewhere, get it up and running, probably do a whole bunch of network stuff to point to the new location. It could be a pretty long road to recovery. It also gives us the capability to do redundancy for backups. So offsite backups are a very important thing for customers and for us to do, which is to have the data stored in multiple locations so that the failure of any one location doesn't wipe out the history of that data. Loans, users, reading histories, if you store them, all kinds of things. So that's an important capability as well. And having that geolocation reach means that we can mirror data potentially between East Coast and West Coast. There are certainly places you wouldn't want to mirror the data based on laws and regulations, but there's a lot of capability available there. And then the expansion piece as well, which is, this is less important, I think, in our industry, but in some industries, if you operate regionally and you sort of expand your footprint and your business grows, your service grows, and you're providing the East Coast and West Coast service, you might have the capability there to expand into multiple regions and provide better service that way. All right, so hopefully that does a good job of highlighting some of the three promised benefits: lower operational burden, or refocusing of resources on more useful, valuable, and frankly fun and interesting, although I'm a nerd, I like this stuff, but frankly fun and interesting activities than just keeping servers running. Security and the reach capability there. So I'm going to jump over here quickly and tell you how to get more info. So I will turn it back over to Ria here shortly. She's going to talk about a poll, and certainly engage with that, there's an opportunity there to indicate that you'd like some more info on this. You can always ask an account manager, or because we're TLC and support is very important to us, you can engage your support reps on these types of things as well. Some of them may be confident enough to answer your technical questions about the cloud, but all of them can find me somewhere in the building if needed. And also plug the ALA is coming up in DC, and we're in the extended DC metro region, part of the TLC team at headquarters. So a number of us will be present there, including probably myself. So if you're planning to attend ALA next month, feel free to stop by, and I'll happily talk your ear off in person about this. So there you go. I'm going to flip it over to QA here and turn it over to the moderator. Hopefully this was a useful bit of information about kind of cloud platform, how they compare and contrast, some of the benefits, and some of the terms of art involved to demystify this concept, which we couldn't have picked anything more specific than cloud, could we? So hope you found this valuable, and look forward to your questions and feedback.
Thanks, Justin. I think that was really great. Certainly a way to demystify and get everyone thinking about the difference between each layer of it. That was a good demonstration. Your security versus you plus vendor, and you plus vendor plus cloud. That's perfect. So at this point, those of you who are joined, you are able to ask questions. I do see we have at least one so far. We'll go ahead and start answering those in just a minute. If not, if you haven't posted a question yet, now is your time to start thinking about that and get those added. We'll give you a little extra time to think about those because we are going to post a couple of polls. So in just a moment, you'll see the first poll on your screen. And if you could take a second to please answer that, we are curious to know where your servers are currently located right now. Is your library using that on-prem or on-premise model that Justin talked about, or potentially hosted locally if you're using an IT vendor nearby? So not necessarily at your library, but at least in that local environment. Potentially you're hosting through TLC already, or if you're not a TLC customer, through your current ILS vendor. Maybe you're hosting through a third-party option. You can indicate that there. Maybe there's another option we didn't mention. Please go ahead and list that other and let us know. And if you're not sure, and there's that I don't know button for you as well. No worries. As I mentioned at the top of the call, with cloud hosting, this was one of those things, like when I worked at the library, I knew that we had servers. I just didn't necessarily know where our data lived. And it wasn't until, working with TLC and talking with Justin about this to really understand the difference and nuance between them. But of course, I'm also not the IT person. So, all right, we have our results back in. It looks like about 47% are currently on premise. 42% are hosted through their ILS vendor, either us or another, and about 11% are through a third party. We have one more poll to share with you to get some additional information, and this has more to do with your library's security budget. So over the past couple of years, how has the percentage of your library's budget for security changed? So have you had a significant allocation more towards security, just maybe a slight allocation more toward? Has it gone less? Have you not seen a whole lot of change? Or maybe your library doesn't budget specifically for security. So there's that option for you as well. And I do see a few questions coming in. That is great. Please keep them coming. We'll get to those in just a moment. And Justin, when you were talking about the cloud layers, I was imagining, like the different stratosphere, and I was trying to make a metaphor for that.
Totally forgot to make my cumulus, nimbus, fractus, etc. joke. Thanks for the reminder.
No worries. All right, it looks like for the majority of our attendees, they do not have specific budget for security. For the rest, it's a three-way split between a significant change, some change, and little to no change. All right, and then the very last, Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just very interesting result. Yeah.
Yeah. And then finally, our last poll question is really more of a way just for us to get in touch with you. If you do want to know more, go ahead and hit that yes, please contact me, and we'll be following up after the webinar. So I'm going to leave that on the screen to let you all kind of make that choice, and then I'm going to start going down through our questions. Now, these are live from our audience. Justin has not prepared, so it's kind of like stump the expert time. All right, our first question is on what cloud provider would TLC be running? Azure, AWS, or Google?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned this along the way very briefly, but we provide both well, I say both, and then I'm going to say three things. So that was bad English, but we provide hosting for library.solution, library.solution for schools, and the Carl solution on the Oracle Cloud. And we work with Oracle Cloud in particular for a couple different reasons. I'll highlight them briefly. One of them is that our technology is pretty heavily based on and takes a lot of advantage of Oracle technology specifically. And we concluded that the Oracle Cloud was the best in class operating environment for the Oracle database, provides a lot of services and capabilities around that that help us deliver a better cloud hosting experience to you. So there's kind of a home court competitive advantage there from a technology standpoint that has proved out pretty well. And then the other one, there is a degree to which some cloud providers in the space, I will not name names, can often be considered a direct or indirect competitor to some of the services provided in the library industry. I hope I didn't make that sound too cheeky. And so there are some solutions that we avoided because there's a little bit of kind of competition to some degree between our customers and them for the service they provide, and there's some benefit to kind of avoiding that conflict. So that's a great question.
Yeah, definitely. And then we have a few more. If your library decides to migrate, will we have IT support from TLC for getting us through this transition?
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm proud of the amount of support we provide there, so I would say yes. I'm being recorded on a webinar, so of course I would say yes no matter what. But one of the folks that works with me in particular does a ton of work on documentation, but also live consulting through things like firewall changes. We support people in contacting vendors. So if your server moves on premise to the cloud, one of the things that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is things like IP addresses are going to change, and sometimes your, ebook vendors or SIP integrators or other things like that need to know about that change. It can be easy to miss that. So we also do a really good job of helping people assess where the impacts are going to be based on our experience, and helping people kind of work through that. Those are just sort of two pieces, but we have a really good kind of implementation, upgrade, migration practice in general. It's part of the sort of service that we're really proud of here. So yeah, we definitely provide a lot of support there, and I believe I won't throw too many details in here and get myself in trouble because I get some of them wrong in a live recording again. But we've definitely had some circumstances as well where customers have asked us to do this very rapidly in response to a security issue that they've had. So we've also proven our ability not just to help, but to help under some pretty extreme circumstances and limited time pressure where required. Now, you want the luxury of doing it more thoughtfully, but we have done some kind of rescue operations there and are pretty proud of those as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of confidence behind the assertion. But I think the answer is yes. It's definitely a pretty wraparound service for getting you smoothly moved into the cloud environment.
Absolutely, and I'll add on to that as well that it's the same team also migrating into TLC services. So if you're on a competitor ILS and choose to switch to TLC, you get that same level of hand-holding through the process as well that you would moving into the cloud.
Yeah, that's great. And sometimes it's the same project at the same time. So works
Yes,
out well.
exactly. All right, we do have another question in the form of a sentence. Please comment on loss of local control, delays in problem solving, and customization to conform to particular collections. Many thanks.
Okay. Can you give me those points one at a time, Ria, so I can make sure I don't miss one?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one is loss of local control.
Loss of local control. Yeah. So I don't, from my vantage point, I would say that there's not a huge amount of loss of local control because, particularly with the web-based service, um, once the firewall ports are open, all of the software is identical to what you would run on premise and actually accessed in the same way. So you mostly lose control over the kinds of things that aren't, in my opinion, a great use of your time. But in terms of like settings, configuration, options, security and privacy decisions, all of those are baked into the software and are the same across environments. So you really don't lose any kind of control there. I guess the one thing that we do sort of run into is in some cases, if there's like a very specific local IT management policy that differs, whether it's in a good way or a neutral way, or maybe even sometimes a concerning way, from kind of the security model we use in the environment, there could be some circumstance where somebody keeps servers locally because they have a very specific requirement to do that for some reason that wouldn't have to do with the library software in particular. Um, but I think that's a general answer, and you may have something more specific in mind. So that would be a great kind of follow-up of what kind of local control are you referring to there. We do sometimes have folks who say, I know we're not supposed to do this, but we use the server on premise that we use for TLC for a bunch of other stuff as well. There's good reasons to do that. Not totally against it, but it does kind of complicate some things. In a circumstance like that, if you move the service into the cloud environment, you still retain that physical server unless you decide to get rid of it for some reason. So you can still continue to use that for whatever its additional purposes were. So yeah, I don't think I have a kind of a specific answer to that, but that's certainly a great follow-up piece. What was
Yeah.
the second one?
Yeah, before I move into that, we did get a comment, someone reiterating what you said. One of our customers says, very supportive, response time second to none. So
Great,
thank
glad
you
to
for
hear.
the shout out. Yeah, the second bullet point on that was delays in problem solving.
Yeah, okay. So I actually have a totally contrary view on this, which is or well, I shouldn't assume the directionality of the question here, but um, one of the advantages of moving specifically from on-premise to the cloud environment is for any point where you engage us to participate in a troubleshooting process, um, we're going to have um, much faster access to the environment because it doesn't involve us initiating a remote connection into your server. So we as the vendor feel like the closer it is to our operating environment from a hosting perspective, the kind of faster and better response time we can provide. Um, and I could probably do a whole webinar on on this topic, and I will avoid that. But we have, more visibility when it's in our cloud environment to the performance of the virtual hardware, resources, all kinds of things that are more visible and accessible to us. And so, in some cases, we can even be proactive about addressing things that wouldn't surface for us in an on-premise situation unless and until you identified an issue and opened a ticket or called into support. And pretty good response time to that, as I think the commenter highlighted. But all of that gets even smoother when we have kind of fewer technical support barriers to access and more visibility and insight to the environment. So we actually feel like that improves our responsiveness and capability actually. And if you talk to somebody who's using the service, hopefully they would agree and validate that claim.
Yep, definitely. I mean, they're moved to comment in the webinar even. Yep.
Mission
Then the last,
accomplished.
and then the last the piece of that, and then there are two more questions after this, is customization to conform to particular collections.
Yeah, I probably would ask for a clarification on that, maybe as a follow-up or whatever. My take on that, which I think I already addressed, is that we're operating the same software with the same kind of capabilities and policy and configuration. It's really about, to the where's my stuff and what are some of the kind of security capabilities and other things around it. But in terms of like kind of collection rules and policies and things like borrower policies and anything that operates as a kind of setting or configuration or decision within the capability of the library software really doesn't change based on the environment, cloud or otherwise. So I don't think that there's really any loss of control or configuration there. But again, if I'm misunderstanding the question, please feel free to make me smarter on that point.
Yeah, feel free to add some clarity to that if you'd like. We will end at the top of the hour, so if we don't get to everything, we'll follow up afterwards. The next question is, would TLC be providing SOC reports to clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a pretty extensive kind of security and privacy policy around the hosting and cloud hosting services that we provide, and we do address SOC 2 reporting in particular as a requirement there, which is one of the capabilities that is benefited by the commercial cloud environment. So that's a yes. There are many other things other than SOC 2, including state level requirements and so on. But that is certainly in there and something that we can address if that is important to you and a requirement you have.
And then the last question I see so far is, does the cloud only store TLC data? Can staff data be saved to the cloud, or will a separate server be needed?
Yeah, so if it's staff data within the context of the kind of solution that we're providing, then that's all stored, in the cloud environment with the server. If you're talking about staff data in terms of, we're using it to save text files or other documents or other things like that, that's really outside of the scope of the cloud solution. So that's something that you would want to keep on the local server, or use some other cloud solution like a Google Drive or Office 365 or something like that. And that's not just because we don't want to have people saving files in our system, but some of that activity actually provides some measure of security risk because of viruses and things like that. So there's some kind of operating restrictions in the hosting and cloud environment there that are for a very good reason around security and service reliability. But yeah, and that again, that's one where depending on what kind of thing you're talking about storing, I think the answer differs. So feel free to reach out to us and engage on that point in particular, and we can address it very specifically to your circumstance.
Thank you. And we did get one additional question has come in. Would TLC share client information with other companies?
No, we do not do this. The only exception I will say, which isn't really an exception, is if an authorized representative of your agency tells us that you want us to do that for some good reason. But barring that, and I won't read the policy verbatim, but our policy is basically it's your data, and the only interest we have in your data is to provide the service that you've contracted with us for, and that's pretty much it. So the only circumstance in which we're sending data to someone else is because you want us to do it as part of your service. So, third-party integration, and some kind of service you integrate with the system, or you say, hey, extract this data and send it to this review agency, things like that that are requested and initiated by an authorized representative of you are in play. Everything else, yeah, it's your data. We don't use it commercially. The closest thing we come to anything like that is you have some optional analytics capabilities, and that is completely, anonymized, deaggregated data, and it's really just so you can get a sense of how your service is being used and who uses it and all that kind of stuff. So those are some, nuances on it, but all of those are totally non-commercial and have nothing to do with anyone's kind of private data in any way. We're very proud of that stance, and I think it's one of the great things about the Library Corporation that we can take that approach pretty unequivocally.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a
Great
great
question.
question.
There's a lot of talk
Yeah.
about that in kind of the space in the industry right now. If anybody has the great misfortune of finding me on social media, it's certainly something that I myself have talked about. I'm very happy to be working somewhere where I feel really good about how we handle data.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very unique, unfortunately, but glad that TLC can provide such an
One of the
extensive
few
privacy
cases where if
policy.
somebody were more competitive with us on that axis, I would actually be happy, sort of, on a from a pro-social standpoint. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. All right, well, that was the last question. Jess, I'm going to have you go to the next slide, and I'm going to just close us out with a few more housekeeping items. As a reminder, before you log out today, please download those handouts, especially if you want more information. There's a great brochure in there about TLC Cloud Services, as well as a nice infographic about cyber hygiene and ways that you can keep your data safe and ways TLC helps you do that as well. If you're going to be traveling in the next month or two, we are going to be at the Florida Library Association next week. We're going to be at the California Library Association in 2 weeks. And then, as Justin mentioned, we'll be at ALA at the end of June. So if you have any additional questions, please stop by and talk to us at the booth. We're happy to answer those. If you want your questions answered a little bit more readily, you can always reach out to us at info@tlcdelivers.com. Again, that's info@tlcdelivers.com. And this was recorded and will be available tomorrow on our website at tlcdelivers.com/webinars. And so if you would like to check that out, share it with your colleagues, share it with your IT staff, please go ahead and do that. And we'll have our next webinar up available tomorrow as well. In a couple of weeks, we'll be talking about cataloging, linked data, BibFrame, all of that good stuff. So please join us again next time, and we'll be happy to share that with you. Justin, thank you so much for your expertise today and for letting us try to stump you in the questions, but I think you got them all. So we'll have to try harder next time, right?
All right. Thanks. No, they were great questions. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, everybody. We will see you on the next one.